The core structure of my animation is complete, and it's time to start animating the constraints to pass the ball from one hammer on to another. Before we jump into that part of our animation, let's do a little bit of scene cleanup and some management, because I'm already starting to think that I'm going to confuse myself with the current name of all of my hammers. Because if you look at the way that it's structured, the computer has named them for me when I duplicated them hammer, hammer 1, hammer 2. Well, in my mind, this is hammer 1, the leftmost one. The middle one is hammer 2, and the third one was, well, hammer number 3. So before we go any further, let's change some names here. This is hammer 1. This one is, hammer 2 is actually hammer 3. So this is a good thing to get into before we go any further, because we are going to confuse ourselves. I have a hunch, and I misspelled hammer on that one somehow. There we go. So let's just double check. Hammer 1, hammer 2. Oh, I misspelled hammer 3. Excuse me. I can spell. There we go. Now we're up and running. In addition to naming all of the objects, make sure you're naming all of their locators as well. That way, you just really get a good sense of the role of these locators that are responsible for the constraints. And I'm just going to put hammer 1 left, hammer 1 right, so on and so forth. Some organization of your data is going to really help. Oftentimes, the challenges that we interact with when it comes to managing these complex setups is just naming conventions. Having our brains understand exactly the role and the function of all these different pieces. The more that we can be explicit and clear, the better. There we go. All right, so I'm pretty pleased with that. Now let's start the process of getting down to business here. What we're going to do is that we're going to animate the first constraint on the ball, okay? And then we're going to animate the constraint on the second one. So let's get ball number 1 kind of moving the way we want. Just like we did with Suzanne on the metronome's arm, what we want to do is that we want to animate the ball so that the constraint moves it to its final location and then leaves it there, and then it'll go back. We're going to animate this arm number 2, hammer number 2, picking up the ball secondary, okay? So let's get this one kind of rolling. All right, so hammer number 1. And I want to animate it so that it leaves the ball in that location. And I'm going to make a decision here. I'm going to make a decision maybe on frame 36. We need to have 2 frames that act as the transition frames between hammer number 1 and hammer number 2. This is the handoff frame, where we're going to be handing off the ball from one constraint, the influence of one constraint, to the influence of another constraint. So let's do it real fast. It's pretty straightforward. So 36 and 37 are going to be my transition frames. I'm going to kind of hold on to that. So on frame 36 and frame 37, we need to do some work. First and foremost, let's go to the ball. And we need to animate the constraints influence down here. Now let's do some other naming conventions. Child of, you can name your constraints. Hammer 1. The target's going to be the locator on the inside of the hammer. That's good. And at this moment in time, we need to start animating the handoff. So on frame 36, we want the influence to be on, so we'll key it in. And then on frame 37, we want the influence to be off, so we'll key that. I'm going to just hit the left key or the right key on my keyboard to advance my playhead forward 1 frame, and we're going to key this off. Now, immediately, you can see that the ball goes back to its original location. On frame 37, the constraint is no longer influencing the location of our ball. The ball's transform channels are determining its location. So in addition to handing off the constraint on frame 36 and frame 37, we also need to key in the location of the ball, or where we want it to be, on frames 36 and frame 37. So let's go back to our ball's transform channels. With the constraint off, it's going back to this value at -3. Well, I don't want it to be on -3 meters and all of this jazz on frame 37. So much like we did on the constraint, let's go to 36. We're going to key in its current location on frame 36. It doesn't really matter what this number is, because we're just keying it in. On frame 37, we want the ball to stay in that spot. Since we already have a set of keyframes on frame 36, any new value that we key in on frame 37 is going to be make it look like the ball is just going to stay right here in between the 2 hammers. Well, what location do we key in? Well, luckily we already have kind of a good understanding of where it is, thanks to the location of our hammers. Now I'm going to turn off the visibility of hammer number 2. Because if you think about it, what we want is that we want the ball to stay right there after the constraint has been deactivated. Now we have some locators here that already determine where that could be, and I've just selected hammer 2 right. That's the connector point for the ball on hammer number 2, and I'm going to tell the computer to go to that guy. I'm going to grab the ball, hold down the shift key, grab hammer number 2. You can either do it visually in the workspace, or we can do it over in our outliner and do shift S. And I'm going to do selection to active. Poof. Now, since we had a keyframe for the ball's location on frame 36, we also need to make sure that we're keying it on frame 37 as well. On frame 36, the constraint's in control. On frame 37, now the object's transform channels are in control, and we're ready to have hammer number 2 receive it. What we should get at the conclusion of this, the constraint's in control, and then once it gets to 37, the object transform channels are in control, and the ball should just stay there. Now, there's a little bit of a jump in here. If you look carefully, that's okay. I mean, if you really wanted it to be, lock solid, you certainly could push it back on frame 37. Really, what's going on frame 37, the location of the ball is at the location of hammer number 2's connector point. With it on, you'll be able to see it real easily. If you want it to really truly stay there, you need the location of the ball on frame 37 to be hammer number 1's connector point. So let's do it real fast. As an illustration, grab the ball, hold on the shift key, grab the element that we want to move it to, shift S, cursor to active. And since the auto key system was on, yeah, it should be okay. I'm going to rekey this. My channels have gone orange. I want them to be this yellow color. There we go. And now the ball should truly just stay right where hammer number 1 leaves it. Cool, huh? Mission accomplished. Since the ball is now kind of hovering in this position, we can add in the influence of another constraint onto the ball to make it look like hammer number 2 is grabbing it and moving it out of the way. Let's do this from the front view so it's a little bit easier to see. And what we're going to do on frame 36 and frame 37 is add another constraint to the ball. We're going to have a stack of constraints on these balls. Let's do it real fast. Let's go into our constraint menu. Here's the first one that constrains the ball to hammer number 1. Well, if we want to constrain the ball to hammer number 2, we have to have a second constraint. So let's do it real fast. Let's add in another child of. And yeah, you can stack these, which is pretty cool. We'll do hammer 2. And what do we want the target to be? I'm going to use my eyedropper to choose hammer 2 right, which is the control locator that we're going to need for hammer number 2. And let's just confirm that. Yep, I selected it in my outliner, and I can see that my move handles are right there, so I know I've selected the right one. Now, much like we did on the influence of the constraint on hammer number 1, we're going to do the exact same kind of handoff thing on the constraint for hammer number 2. So if you look at the keyframing here, the influence on frame 36, the hammer number 1 is on. Well, we want hammer number 2 to be off in this moment. So let's turn it off and key it in. And the reason we have to turn it off and key it is so that we can turn it on frame 37. So we'll go forward to frame 37. The influence of the first constraint is off. So that means the influence of the second constraint needs to be on. And just make sure it's keyed. Let's see what we get. Let's go back to the beginning of our animation. Huzzah! Look at that. And the hammer number 2 takes the ball. So the easiest way to get through this is to first animate an individual constraint. Have that constraint leave the ball in its current location, and then stack that additional constraint into the system. It's a pretty straightforward process, and I'm going to do the exact same thing for the third one as I did for the first.